Hey guys, Ethan from Tag Mods here, and this is our Sydney Opera House build. So Corsair challenged us to build an Australian themed PC. Obviously, there were many ways we could have taken this project, but given it to be seen by a global audience, I really wanted to avoid the gimmicky stereotypes that Australia has and really focus on our First Nation culture and one of Australia's finest buildings. So let's just show you how I built it.
Let's jump straight into the hardware we're using for the build. We've got the Asus B550F with the matching 2080, the AMD 3900X, the Corsair SF750 with the white cable kit, the MP600 Pro 2TB water-cooled SSD, 32GB of Vengeance Pro SL RAM, a bunch of HydroX gear including the XD7 block, XD5 pump and QL120 fans. Just like our last few Corsair builds, we'll also be modding a full set of peripherals with a K70, Virtuoso SE and a Saber Pro mount. I kept all the peripheral mods relatively simple to ensure that they were all still usable at the end. So for the keyboard, I stripped it, painted the base silver and the keys white to match the Opera House, and then put it all back together, and that was it. I used a 3mm piece of MDF to make a template so the Virtuosos could sit flush and not move while the laser was running. I then etched the tile pattern from the sails of the Opera House onto each piece. The Saber also got the sail treatment with it being etched on the top plate. The rest of the mouse is painted white and silver, just like the keyboard, and then put back together. Building the Opera House itself proved to be exponentially more difficult than I originally imagined. The plan for the build was to build a 3-tiered custom chassis, with power supply and cables in the bottom floor, hardware in the middle on a floating shelf, and the Opera House on top of a clear platform so you could see through into the hardware. I started by building the box itself because A, that defined my scale, and B, it was the easiest part of the build because I hadn't got my head around the sails yet. That was just built out of MDF that was laser cut and then glued together. The floating shelf was held up with little 6mm pieces that I put all the way around the border. I wanted this box to be elevated so airflow could pull down and through, since I wanted intake fans in the sails of the Opera House. So I cut some pieces of Tasmanian oak and attached them to the bottom. The box was painted black inside and out so it would be discreet and not draw your attention when looking down in through the acrylic top shelf. The false floor was painted the same concrete colour that the Opera House sits on in real life, which is like a stony brown kind of effect, and I also textured that. I had to cut a whole bunch of holes in the false floor for the motherboard cables, GPU cables, PCI riser, airflow for the radiators, and some convenient handholds because it was a real pain in the butt to put in and out. But with all the holes there, I could mount some hardware. I chamfered the screw holes from behind so I could use the regular size screws on the radiators to hold them in place. Flipped it over and mounted the fans on the top side so that it'll pull air down from the top of the acrylic down in through the big hole I'd cut in the bottom of the box off camera. To get the motherboard ready to mount, I got the CPU and water block mounted, as well as the RAM and the M.2 SSD before screwing it to the false floor. We also had to water block our 2080, so I stripped down the Strix card and then slapped on the XG7 Corsair block. It makes it super easy to do because everything's pre-done for you, so there's minimal thought required. I used 6mm acrylic to make the top lid, and I ran the CNC around it a couple of times to carve a channel so that it would be keyed in and sit snugly around the MDF frame. I then put it on the laser cutter and cut all the way around it the outside to get a nice clean cut, and we also cut holes for the fans. Corsair asked us to produce a build that represented Australia. I believe this couldn't be done without acknowledging and celebrating the rich history of our First Nations culture. The The art used on the veneer comes directly from the Badu Gili exhibitions projected on the Sydney Opera House sails. The original projections are what's playing in the corner of the screen. Badu Gili continues the traditions of Bennelong Point, formerly known as Chugabali, which means where the knowledge waters meet. This has been a gathering place for community, ceremony, and storytelling for thousands of years. The art was directly etched into 1.5mm veneer plywood before being glued and applied to the outside box in sequence, ensuring it told the same story. Now for the hard part of the build, the sails. Originally I tried to build the sails out of 2mm acrylic, but as you can see here, bending it just didn't work. I ended up with a lot of flat spots and it just was a no-go. So I went back to the drawing board and decided to try pepakura, which is a origami type technique. So I flattened it out, made the template and cut it out of cardboard. It worked super well, got the exact shapes and forms that I wanted, and I figured this could be a valid method. So I tried to do it out of a couple different materials, including the 2mm acrylic. That just didn't work. The bends just weren't there. There wasn't the flex in the material. So then I also tried a thermoplastic, which worked, but I also ended up with rather uneven surfaces that were really hard to patch and fill. I feel like these sails could have worked in the long run, but they just weren't quite the mark. So the final technique that I tried was hips, which is a compressed polystyrene plastic that had the flex we needed, and we could also, more importantly, we could etch the tile pattern into it quite easily. The origami pepakura method didn't work with this material at all. It just didn't have quite the flex and bends that we needed to get around, especially given that each piece goes in different directions. It ended up being quite brittle and would just snap. So I tried to take individual pieces and glue them together one piece at a time based on a template that I'd marked out on a piece of MDF. This worked really, really well. So with a proof of concept, I went back to the laser and cut out all the individual pieces. These were all glued together individually, again using my trusty MDF guide that was just a bunch of lines marked out on a scrap piece of MDF that allowed me to make sure that each sail would fit inside the next. Given that we were gluing them as individual pieces, we did lose a lot of the flex per piece that we had with the pepakura method. With the sails built and attached to our acrylic piece, I had to build a wiring loom. So the wiring loom had to run from the power source to each of the 3 individual sails to run the RGB LED nest that was underneath each building. So to do this, I needed quick disconnects under each of the buildings so that the top could be added and removed without all these wires being in the way. I then made some quick diffuse covers out of 3mm acrylic that I then put frosted spray paint on just to cover the front of the domes, just to break out that light nice and evenly. And with that, I present the Opera House.